It's time for the Bible. We don't really know for sure what is and what is not. Holy Ghost, God, agnostic, God blasted him on the spot. Ghost. Friends, it's time for the Bible. Jesus on the planet. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Let's take another stab at the Bible, Geek. Not literally, of course. That wouldn't be a whole lot of fun. Maybe for you, but not for me. Anyway, some questions, or here actually is an answer. There was a fascinating, detailed question setting out some of the listeners' inferences from David Trobisch's fascinating book, the first edition of the New Testament, and how the thesis might be developed further. I sent this on to David Trobisch, and he supplied a brief, positive answer. He said, I very much enjoyed the response of the colleague. He absolutely understood the direction in which further thought needs to develop, understanding the New Testament as a publication of the 2nd century. His thoughts are right on. So, nice work there. Okay, here's some supplementary information about African Jews from Noah Mork. He says, a few episodes back, there was some discussion about the diffusion of biblical/Jewish customs into sub-Saharan Africa. I think I can shed some light on this. The Lemba are not the same as the Falashas of Ethiopia. By the way, I think the latter don't like that term. It means stranger in Amharic and is somewhat derogatory. I'm not sure what the correct term is. I think it's something like Beni Israel or Sons of Israel. Anyway, the Lemba are a tribe or ethnic group in southern Africa. They claim to have Jewish ancestry and practice several recognizably Jewish customs. Such groups are a dime a dozen, especially where missionaries have been selling their snake oil, but the Lemba might be the real deal. Genomic analysis has distinguished several markers of Jewish ancestry in many of them. How it came to be remains a mystery. Back to the Jews of Ethiopia. Genetic analysis done so far seems to reveal that they are as Ethiopian as Injera, Injeera. Of course, the Ethiopians themselves are a partially Semitic people who speak a Semitic tongue, so who can say? The established consensus on Ethiopian Judaism, to the extent that there is a consensus, is that they were influenced by Jews from Yemen and other areas of southern Arabia. At first glance, this seems plausible. There has certainly been a lot of cultural and demographic exchange between the two regions, but the Jews of Yemen, etc., were and are adherents of normative rabbinic Judaism. The Jews of Ethiopia do not have any consciousness of the Talmud, etc., and have indeed come up with some unique features and documents of their own, as you note. A look at the beliefs and practices they do have really does suggest that they split off from mainstream Judaism at a very early period. So again, who knows? The questioner also asked about diffusion of customs in the opposite direction, from sub-Saharan Africa to the Middle East. If the out-of-Africa theory of human origins is true, and I think it is pretty close to beyond dispute at this point, there are probably many customs and aspects of what we would call human nature that first showed themselves in Africa. Circumcision may be one. As you note, circumcision was an Egyptian custom before it was a Hebrew one, and Egypt was nothing if not a confluence of Middle Eastern and African influences. Thanks, Noah Mork. Great. So, John Brockman. A few questions from John. Sometime back, I introduced myself to a fellow at the gym, Herb, a good guy. And when he learned my name is John, he immediately regaled me with a brief sermon on the wonders of John the Baptist, who had to be perfect and without sin in order to baptize greasy Josh. Footnote, Jesus equals Joshua, Christ equals anointed with oil, hence greasy Josh. That's a new one on me. Every once in a while thereafter, when I saw him at the gym, he would remind me of how awesome John the Baptist is. I'd smile and nod and get on with my workout. I don't know what church Herb belongs to, and the various churches my mother took me to as a child, Presbyterian, Methodist, Episcopalian, First Baptist, never to my recollection emphasized John the Baptist in this way, but it seems clear to me that here in South Carolina, at any rate, the veneration of John the Baptist is alive and well. It seems to me that this would offer the perfect rebuttal to the fatuous argument from embarrassment regarding Jesus getting baptized by someone else. If John the Baptist is still venerated in this way 2,000 years later, how much more powerful must the story have been when his cult was still alive and well? And I guess the argument from embarrassment there, it must have happened because the baptism of Jesus by John created such a headache for Christians. Why would any of them ever have invented it? Of course, that's fatuous for other reasons too. I mean, presumably it was not offensive to Mark and whoever he got it from, right? And it's easy to see why not. I mean, precisely because John was sort of a sage and a prophet, well, all the better that Jesus is linked up with him. You're almost understanding Jesus is riding his coattails if the reader is already familiar with John's good reputation. So once people from the John the Baptist movement begin drawing these inferences, well, I mean, who's greater, Billy Graham or the schmuck that comes forward in his rally, then things get a little bit uneasy. But yeah, I mean, if Christians today think highly of John, wouldn't they have all that time ago and have been proud at John's involvement? I mean, they are now. I think you're right. That is not necessarily an embarrassment, or at least the fact that it was to some early Christians does not mean it always had been or would have to be logically. Let's see now. This is Bertilac de Haute Dessert. I'm not sure. I think could be a real name. But if there's a pun in there, I don't get it. Anyway, I finished the Human Bible New Testament a few weeks ago and enjoyed it greatly. I particularly appreciated the unshuffling of Philippians and John, and also the many citations of Christian Lindner. As I remarked to my wife after seeing the restored version of Lang's Metropolis, now it makes sense. By coincidence, around the same time, I read Robot Jesus and Three Other Jesuses You Never Knew by Kyle Bashir's Kindle version. This book is about misapprehensions of Jesus. His thesis is simple. His version of Jesus is the truth, and those of other religions and Christian sects are lies. Here's what Amazon says about the author. His education includes a Master of Religious Education from Liberty Baptist Theological Seminary and a Bachelor of Science in Biblical Studies from the Moody Bible Institute of Chicago. What caught my eye in particular was Bashir's critique of the Jehovah's Witnesses' New World Translation. They translate John 1:1 as, and the Word was a God, small g. He writes, translating John 1:1 this way, however, breaks a well-established rule in Greek, which has led many leading Greek scholars to reject it. He quotes Bruce M. Metzger as saying, as a matter of solid fact, however, such a rendering is a frightful mistranslation. It overlooks entirely an established rule of Greek grammar which necessitates the rendering and the word was God, capital G. He further quotes Metzger as saying, if the Jehovah's Witnesses take this translation seriously, they are polytheists. I noticed that your translation of John 1:1 reads, was a God with a capital G. Would you please offer an apologia of your alleged frightful mistranslation? Incidentally, I recall from your podcast that there was an actual translation error in the Human Bible, New Testament. The details escape me. Have you posted errata anywhere? Actually, there were a whole bunch of goofs of one kind or another, I'm sorry to say, but I believe we did correct all of those. They were errors in the pre-Nicene New Testament, of which the Human Bible New Testament constitutes about half of the traditional canonical books. And I believe John Felix and I weeded out all those mistakes there. There may be others we missed, and I would very much welcome people pointing them out to me. Okay, I hesitate to say this about the great Metzger, who I had a class with. He's, he's just so great. So I'm sorry we lost him. But as another evangelical, Dave Carson, points out, this rule is not the whole story. What Metzger is referring to, unless I'm really mistaken, is that since theos is it has no has no article in it, you ordinarily could translate a God. Rather, if it was hotheos, the God, that would have to mean the one and only God. But the fact, and this is what the witnesses are banking on, the fact that there is no article would mean a God. But Metzger says, if you have a predicate nominative, right? It's not a direct object. It's like the word was whatever it is, right? It's not a direct object. It's you're just saying something about the subject of the sentence. If you have a predicate nominative, you can drop any article, even if you ordinarily would use one about it. So what this means is, if the writer had meant to say the word was the God, he needn't have used a definite article. And he says that's where the witnesses are mistaken. But Dave Carson points out, it actually could go either way. The witnesses may well be right. It's a matter of interpretation, not translation. And a God with a capital G, I'm trying to get that across, that there's some implication about the nature of God that is shared. I mean, I'm sort of trying to give a Nicene approach to it, but to say that it's not necessarily Trinitarianism yet. It is ambiguous. Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to do there is to preserve the studied ambiguity you have in Philo, for instance, who talks about the logos of the word as being God's reason, his wisdom, his mind, and how it is externalized in several steps until it becomes the creative word of Genesis 1. And I think this is the same studied ambiguity that underlies the Old Testament usage of the Shekinah, the Spirit, the name, things like that, that you want to safeguard the transcendence of God philosophically. You don't want him hands-on involved in the subject-object distinction, as Tillich would say. But on the other hand, you don't want to say it was somebody else who did this stuff. And so I try to preserve that by saying a God, and yet to say that it's not like Apollo or Hermes versus Zeus. There's something else going on there that's a bit stronger, though not yet articulated into the Trinity yet. So that's really what I'm driving at there. Okay. And another one from John. He says, well, sure, the wizard was made up, but Dorothy met someone in the Emerald City. Interesting. You know what that's a reference to, this thing I frequently quote from the comic strip Jesus and Mo, where trying to prove the resurrection from the empty tomb is like trying to prove the existence of the Emerald City by saying, well, where does the yellow brick road lead? Anyhow, fully half of the Pauline letters are admittedly by all but the most hardline fundamentalists. Fully half of the Pauline letters are admitted by all but the most hardline fundamentalists to be later forgeries. What reason do we have to believe that the other half aren't as well, but more cohesive? That is to say, to stop borrowing the Wizard of Oz analogy and jump to another fandom, there was no Dr. Watson, merely an Arthur Conan Doyle writing an account by a fictional Watson. Is there anything outside the Bible to indicate the existence of some sort of Paul? Or should we be as agnostic about his existence as about everything else reported in the New Testament? I would say the latter, but as I explain in The Amazing Colossal Apostle, I think that Paul is probably, the historical Paul is probably to be identified with Simon Magus, mentioned, of course, in the book of Acts, but also in Josephus. And I'd refer you to that book rather than beating it to death here. Here is one more from John. I've long treasured my copy of Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel as a wonderful text with great explanatory power. In it, he states, among many other things, that pastoralism, farming, and hunting-gathering were three lifestyles available to ancient people that they could mix, match, or move between as circumstances dictated. He also states that whenever populations adopting different styles encountered one another, they tended to disdain one another and fight for resources, as each lifestyle requires its adherents to alter the landscape in very different ways. For example, clearing out farmland versus maintaining a lightly wooded hunting landscape. Thus, I've always read the story of Cain and Abel as being at least in part, a justification for aggression by the sheep-herding riders against their farming neighbors. They hit us first, they're bastards, go kill all of them. God really loves us and our sheep. He hates them and their stupid veggies. Kill them all, kill them to death. They said you look like dorks. Would there be anything else to support this, or is it just an interesting idea? Well, you can't prove these things, but I think that's the case. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff going on, all sorts of uses to which Cain and Abel are put, even just within chapter 4 of Genesis. But I think this is one of them. Notice it does not say what it was about Cain's offering of vegetables that displeased God. Simply that it seems to me that he's a Canaanite and God is the God of the shepherds. So I think you're quite right. I think that is the point of that, at least one of the points. Well, I got to wrap it up for today. A little shorter than usual, I'm afraid, but I got to get going and do some other stuff and wanted to squeeze in one geek at least. So thank you for being with us. Keep those questions coming in. I do have a few more for the next time, though, and I'll be seeing you soon on another exciting episode of The Bible Geek.